Hello and welcome to English Literature with Susan. Today I want to talk about poetry of the 20th century, the English poetry, its developments, the main figures, how poetry is influenced by some movements like Imagism. The topic of today's discussion is poetry and 20th century, especially the first decades or the first half of the 20th century. If you see these, let's see, these fish here, it is, and these fish are here, so that I can remind you of the influence of such Eastern traditions as haiku, or Oriental ones, or Far Eastern traditions like haiku and Chinese poetry, or different syllabic languages, or even hieroglyphic or ideogrammatic languages like Chinese and Japanese on English poetry, because haiku is a short form, and modernist poetry is trying to be as technical as the techniques of life are. No, this is a great age of technicality, and people in factories, in industries, and or different corporations were trying to work on the technique. Everything is becoming mechanized, or machination is important. And here in poetry, such a thing is also happening, that form is important, that the technique is important. So art becomes the mirror of the real life, especially poetry. So the content doesn't matter. Here, the modernists focus on form itself, and the work of art itself. And these Chinese and Japanese forms like haiku, because they showed that form consciousness, because they were short, they followed the brevity of the time, were matching the ideas of poets such as Ezra Pound. The Imagist movement started around 1910s, and it was fashionable in the teens and also in the 1920s. Although Imagism as a movement does not exist, even today, but we can say that this is the most, let's say, influential and significant poetic movement at the time, because every poet, whether they liked it or not, whether they are called marked by Imagism or not, their poetry shows something of that Imagist. What is Imagism? Imagism, in short, is to focus on the image itself. They believe that poetry is not about images. Poetry is not about the thing, for example. It's about wordings, about sensations, feelings, ornamentations of language, rather than the thing itself. So, as Rupan suggested, the poetry should be a reflection of the thing itself. It should be about the thing itself, or as he puts it, a direct treatment of the thing. In order for this direct treatment of the thing, poetry should be short, because you don't use other ornaments, other emotions, sensations, are part of the poem. So you focus on the image, and you try to talk about that image without any extra comments. That's why sometimes reading these images poetry is difficult. The main, let's say, in fact, Imagism produces its abstraction, because it follows minimalism. There are no more explanations in a poem. The poem becomes an abstract form of art. So the Imagist movement, influenced by the philosopher poet T. Holmes' insistence on hard, clear, precise images, the poetry is solidified, arose in reaction to what it saw as romantic fuzziness and facile emotionalism in poetry. So this is the most important aspect of poetry in 20th century, and many poets are influenced by this movement. But the main proponents are T. Home himself, and his philosophy brought forth the idea. Ezra Pound is the first philosopher or theorizer of the movement, and he's the one who gives the movement its name, or he propagates the name. Whenever H.D. or Hilda de Little sent him one of her poems, Pound wrote in the bottom that imagist. Imagist, the term is taken from French painting. And Paris, and then, the vase always end in Paris in the 20th century. Paris was a center of culture, center of arts, and imagism or imagist poetry was fashion at the time. They focused on the image itself, and now Pound is using the term to refer to a specific form of poetry as well. H.D. Hilda de Little, to call Hilda de Little H.D. was also Ezra Pound's suggestion. He believed that if the poems are short, the name of the poet should also become shorter because her name was too long, maybe. Ezra Pound suggested that if you write short poetry, call yourself HD. So he also added an HD at the bottom of each of Hilda de Little's poems. Another important proponent of the movement, one of the anthologizers as well of the poems written in imagism, is Emil Lowell. Emil Lowell had changed somehow the paradigms put forth by Ezra Pound, and after a while, it was Amy Lowell, who was the most important images figure. Ezra Pound was not happy about this, and he said that this is no more imagism, this is imagism. Ironically, Pound and Amy Lowell had a kind of friendship, but Pound was not that much respectful towards Amy Lowell. Amy Lowell was very fat. I have put one of her poems in one of my videos so you can watch it, September 1918. Amy Lowell was called by Ezra Pound Hippopotamus as it did because she was fat and she had a huge body. Ezra Pound body shamed her and called her Hippopotamus. It was very imagist actually to call her this. He had used an adjective supporting the ideas of images, and but it was very disrespectful on the side of Ezra Pound. Another figures are Richard Addington and John Gold Fletcher. Addington and Hilda Little were in a relationship, and F.S. Flint. Images insisted on direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective, so it can be very subjective. And if this treatment is subjective, the poem becomes very difficult. And the avoidance of all words that did not contribute to the presentation and a freer metrical movement. So many of the images poems are written in free verse because the free verse is giving a better space for the poet to treat the image itself than a strict adherence to the sequence of a metronome. So Ezra Pound thought that poetry should follow its own internal rules of music. It doesn't mean that a poem which is written in free verse by many of these figures is just free verse and not following any kind of musicality. The poems are prosodic, but in each of them, the poet has introduced an internal system of music, or let's say a modern form of metrics. The images wrote short, sharply edged, descriptive lyrics, but the elected technique for the production of longer and more complex poems. This technique was later on added by Ezra Pound himself and T.S. Eliot. So there were some poets who had the power to combine images and with other forms, longer forms, including T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, let's say, is the most important poetical figure of the 20th century besides W.B. Yeats. T.S. Eliot is the father figure for many of the later poets. Everyone is somehow reacting to him. Just look at W.H. Auden's poetry and his ideas on T.S. Eliot. Just look at Robert Lowell. So, in the later part of the 20th century, many poets were reacting to T.S. Eliot because he's actually very great. T.S. Eliot was influenced by metaphysical tradition of poetry. Sir Herbert Grierson, in 1912, collected a volume of John Donne's poems, and metaphysical poetry was revived in English culture. John Donne was almost forgotten at the time. If you're interested in metaphysical poetry, you can refer to my video on metaphysical poetry and metaphysical conceit with an example on one of John Donne's poems. Metaphysical poetry focuses on the combination of intellect and emotion, and T.S. Eliot thought that this is the best form. And the most important technique they used was metaphysical conceit. Metaphysical conceit was a form of metaphor which was so far-fetched. So in order to get the meaning of the metaphor, you had to think. So you had to engage your intellect to understand what was on in that metaphor or what the poet means by a metaphor. So T.S. Eliot reintroduced metaphysical conceits into English poetry. Metaphysicals were almost forgotten for 2 centuries, and then Grierson revived the poetry, and T.S. Eliot revived the tradition. T.S. Eliot himself was an American poet. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri, but he wasn't satisfied with that. He wasn't satisfied with being educated at Harvard University. He wanted to be the greatest figure in English poetry, not American poetry. So he migrated to Great Britain, and later on he became a British subject. So he was part of the circles who were of the poets who were living in Europe, but they were Americans, like Ezra Pound. The revived interest in metaphysical wit or metaphysical conceit brought with it a desire on the part of pioneering poets to introduce into their work a much higher degree of intellectual complexity than had been found among the Victorians or the Georgians. So, a metaphysical conceit I told you, is difficult to understand. And in T.S. Eliot thinks also the poetry should become difficult, and he considered that code in writing his poems as well. As you can see here, one of his poems, the famous The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the poem starts like this: "Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient eaterize upon a table." This is kind of a metaphysical conceit to suggest that the evening or the moment of the sunset is like this, and that the sun or the light is just like an eaterized patient, unawake, unconscious, on, on, let's say, on the bed of the sky. So this is a form of metaphysical conceit, and if you're interested in this poem, you can review my video on the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock as well. T.S. Eliot was a great theorizer of poetry. He made some suggestions for poetry. His two main techniques to use in poetry is complexity and elusiveness. So T.S. Eliot extended the scope of imagism by bringing the English metaphysicals and the French symbolists, as well as the English Jacobean dramatists, to the rescue. He made many allusions to these figures in his poetry, to Jacobean dramatists. And like Fletcher, and also Thomas Middleton in the Wasteland, and also some 17th century poets such as Andrew Marvell, and of course Shakespeare. They rescued us, adding new criteria of complexity and elusiveness to the criteria of concreteness and precision stressed by the images. So T.S. Eliot's main technique is to make his poetry complex by using allusions or quotations from other figures, sometimes without any markers, without any warning. So the audience is surprised by the difficulty, by the complexity of it. Sometimes even the audience may not get his allusions if he doesn't check, if the audience, don't check his footnotes or the footnotes added by the editors. And one other important contribution of T.S. Eliot is the shift from formal to colloquial in a rapid pace. So his poetry moves on or shifts between these two voices. And in this way, his poetry becomes more inclusive. While he's alluding to Shakespeare, for example, he also adds part of a folk song about Shakespeare in his poetry. Wasteland is an example. In Wasteland, in the second part, a game of chess, the man and the woman are talking, and and once the man talks about Shakespeare's The Tempest, and a few lines later, he kind of mocks Shakespeare by rehearsing a rag or a song, a street song about Shakespeare. And so he moves from that formal eloquence language to the colloquial, or a game of chess itself, the second part of the baseline, is an example of this, because we have two couples, one of them wished the other poor and the rich couple's life is full of allusions to literature, to Paradise Lost by Milton, to Virgil's Aeneid, to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. But on the other hand, when we go over the life of the poor couple, it's just ordinary language, and even the mainstay words, the cuddy words, good night, for example, is said. So this is the technique used by T.S. Eliot. Another influential movement in the poetry of 20th century is Surrealism. I will talk about the characteristics of Surrealist writing, but let us just review here. The Surrealists such as Salvador Dali and André Breton were both poets and painters. Surrealism started with the works of Dada, and then later on, André Breton was influenced by Dada's paintings and works and ideas. So he wrote the Manifesto of Surrealism, and in that manifesto explained the rules of Surrealism. So Dali and Breton both worked as painters and poets, and in their verbal as well as their visual art, they sought to express often the free association, free association. So the combination of the images of the ideas doesn't follow a logical trend. The operation of the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind, or the deep mind, and the workings of the deep mind is the aim of the surrealists, and they try to reach that aim by various means. For example, they follow the sequence of the images in a dream. They were influenced by the dream play of August Strindberg, the 19th century Swedish dramatist. In the latter part of his career, Strindberg wrote dream plays. In his dream plays, he was influenced by the dreams, how psychologically they are working, and how one image is combined with other images. And to show the unconscious mind, or the workings of the deep mind, they use a technique called automatic writing. By automatic writing, they meant that you have to write while you're not conscious, or you're not at least conscious to a good extent. So, in order to reach that state in which you're not conscious, but you can write, sometimes they didn't sleep for some nights or some days. So they would experience a state between being awake and being asleep. Or sometimes they use some drugs to experience this state. Let us just review some of the characteristics of surrealism, free association, which now we know, broken syntax. When you follow dreams, when you follow your unconscious, the unconscious mind, according to Freud, doesn't follow rules. The unconscious is inconsistent. The unconscious can include many paradoxes and conflicts in it, so it doesn't understand them. And when you follow the rules, or when you want to find the depth of the mind, you also reflect some broken syntax. We have seen people who, for example, who are not sober for some reason. They are under drugs, they use some medications, or they have used alcohol. So sometimes their language becomes broken, and this is the case with the surrealists as well. So the syntax or language is somehow not following the structure, the main structure of any languages they are writing in, non-logical and non-chronological order. So doesn't follow their stories. Their works do not follow kind of linear plot or linear order. And dreamlike or nightmarish sequences are also involved. Just imagine that Franz Kafka has written a work, Metamorphosis, in which someone is awakened one day, and he sees that he has become a cockroach. Nothing is logical about that story. Just imagine it. And the final part, the juxtaposition of bizarre, shocking, or seemingly unrelated images, all combined together with a non-logicality in the course of the story or the poem. Or the painting, as you can see, the face of war with Salvador Dali. You can see the war within a war and within a war, how everything is just repeating itself, and the barrenness of this painting. And Woman with Head of Roses, again, by Salvador Dali, shows this. Nothing is logical. That we have a lonely person here, very existential type of loneliness. This chair, man chair, let's say, or woman chair, and the woman's body itself that doesn't seem like a natural body, and the garden in there. So as you can see, nothing seems to be logical here, and that someone is painting this other woman, or this painting again, Butterfly, in the book by Salvador Dali, shows what is surrealism. And finally, we have this one, Pro Elisa by Andre Breton. As you can see again, the painting is an abstract one. Surrealism, it means to see what is beyond realism. The term itself means that. So the painting, rather than being realistic, is surrealistic. It shows the deep and what is beyond that face, or what is hidden behind it. And some poems, some poetical movements of the 20th century are the nationalist ones, especially after the colonial era. Many writers started to write about their experiences as colonized subjects. Maybe the most important figure among them is Seamus Heaney, the poet from Northern Ireland. Seamus Heaney was a Catholic, and he was born in Northern Ireland as a religious minority, because the majority of the people in that country, in that part of the country, are actually Protestants. As a minority, he had experienced many things, the sectarian bloodshed represented in his poetry. And what is happening to him is it something unique, let me tell you. He draws on both Irish genres and sonorities and the English literary tradition. So both of them, both the colonial background and the Irish background, or the culture and the literature of the colonizer, and his experience as a colonized subject is introduced. This painting, which you can see here, depicts an image in his poem, famous poem, Digging. Digging is the first poem in his first volume, The Death of a Naturalist. And in that poem, he sets his tradition. He talks about his ideas. He wants to dig the soil of his country with the tip of his pen. So he's maybe a true heir of Jonathan Swift, who said that the tip of my pen is sharper than their swords, and he is showing that post-colonial identity after the First World War in his poetry. About sectarian bloodshed and violence, he had written many poems, and in his Nobel lecture later on, entitled "Crediting Poetry," he talks about it. For example, that when he wanted to receive his Nobel Prize in 1995, he made a speech, and in that speech, he referred to the cruelty of bloodshed. He narrated an anecdote, one of the stories, which showed the struggle between the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland. And finally, there were other post-colonial figures belonging to the other colonies of England, such as Nigeria. In this picture, you can see Wole Soyinka. He was from Nigeria, but though he had written his plays and his poetry and his fiction in English, he always addresses the culture of his own people and represents them via English language in his work. So in poetry as well as in fiction, Nigeria was the most prolific Anglophone African nation around the time of independence, mid 20th century, said to be the golden age of letters in sub-Saharan Africa. And Wole Soyinka, later the first Black African to win the Nobel Prize, stretched English syntax and figurative languages in poems, danced with Yoruba inspired wordplay and myth. An example is his play The Blood and the Jewel. In The Blood and the Jewel, the play is written in English, but we see the struggle between the struggle over a bowman called City, between an old man who represents the old system or the national traditional Nigerian system of living, and a man who is influenced by the Western culture, the English culture, and City at the end of the play as one with that old man rather than the young, westernized man. So this was my explanation and just descriptions of the poetry of the 20th century. I hope you have enjoyed my video, and I can see you in my next video.